Have you ever wondered why we chase love? Why we find ourselves yearning for someone's gaze, someone's touch, someone's words to fill the quiet spaces inside us? It starts early, long before we even understand what love means. As children, we crave the warmth of a mother's embrace, the smile of a father's approval. We chase after friendships, desperate to belong, to be wanted. And then, one day, it turns into something more. A glance that lingers too long. A heartbeat that skips for someone else. And in that moment, we become willing prisoners of a feeling so beautiful, so intoxicating, yet so dangerously fleeting. We're told by stories, by movies, by songs that love is the ultimate salvation, the missing piece to make us whole. Find your soulmate and your loneliness will disappear. Find the one and life will finally make sense. It's a promise whispered to us in 1,000 ways, and we chase it like thirsty travelers in a desert chasing a mirage. But here's the thing no one tells you, that no matter how many times you fall in love, how deeply, how completely, there's always a part of you left empty. A quiet ache in the middle of joy, a silent fear when happiness gets too close, and sometimes in the dead of night when you lie awake staring at a ceiling you can't even see, you realize you're still searching. Why? Why is it never enough? You see, Buddhism has never rejected love. It doesn't tell you to shut your heart or to run away from affection. But it does ask you to pause and to look deeper, to question whether what you call love is truly love or something else entirely. Because so often, what we think is love is really a beautiful disguise for craving. A craving for validation, a craving for belonging, a craving to fill the invisible void within us. And craving in Buddhist philosophy is the root of suffering. The Buddha spoke of this in countless teachings. He spoke of attachment, of clinging to things we believe will save us, to people, to moments, to emotions that rise and fall like waves in the vast ocean of existence. And romantic love, more than almost anything else, becomes a trap when it's tangled in attachment. It's not the love itself that hurts us. It's the desperate need behind it, the belief that if this person loves me, then I matter. If they leave, I am nothing. That's the invisible longing we carry, day after day. A hunger for something outside of ourselves to complete what feels broken inside. And yet, no one escapes it. Not the rich, not the poor, not the wise, not the foolish. Even monks, before they renounce the world, feel the pull of this invisible thread. Because it's part of being human. But what if, just what if, we've misunderstood what love is supposed to be? What if love isn't meant to complete us, but to awaken us? You see, in Buddhism, the highest form of love is not possession or obsession. It's not a transaction where I give you this and you give me happiness in return. It's something far purer, something so vast it cannot be contained within two hearts alone. It's called Metta, loving kindness, a love without conditions, a love that asks for nothing back. A love that simply wishes for the happiness of others, whether they stay or go, whether they choose us or not. And the reason it feels so foreign to us is because we've been taught to love with chains, not wings. To bind those we adore, to wrap them tightly in expectations, in silent demands. To say, be mine, complete me, save me from myself. No wonder it hurts when those bonds break. But imagine for a moment a love that could set someone free. A love that says, I wish you happiness, even if that happiness isn't with me. A love that finds joy in another's joy, not in their obedience to your desires. That is the kind of love Buddhism speaks of. Not to erase love, but to purify it. To strip away the hunger and leave only light. It doesn't mean you won't fall in love. It doesn't mean you won't ache, or long, or miss someone so much it feels like your chest might collapse. You will. But you'll begin to see those moments not as chains, but as mirrors, reflections of your own heart's longings. And in that reflection, an invitation to wake up. Because the deepest truth is this: no one, not even the greatest love of your life, can fill the emptiness within you. That space is yours to meet, yours to understand, and perhaps yours to heal. And when you no longer need someone to complete you, you're finally free to love them truly, not for what they give you, but simply because love is what you are. This is where our journey begins. Not with answers, but with a question. What is it you're really looking for when you fall in love? And when you dare to look beneath the surface, what you might discover isn't just about romance. It's about the entire way you've been taught to seek happiness, and the subtle, beautiful possibility of another way. Let's begin. Somewhere along the winding path of life, we were taught that love must hurt. That to truly love is to risk everything, to surrender yourself to someone else's hands, hoping they'll hold you gently and fearing they won't. It's strange, isn't it? That the very thing meant to uplift us so often ends up breaking us. But maybe it's not love itself that wounds us. Maybe it's what we've confused love with. In the ancient teachings of the Buddha, love wasn't painted in shades of jealousy, fear, or possession. It wasn't something you clung to with trembling hands. It was something you gave freely, abundantly, like the sun shines on the earth without asking who deserves its warmth. The Pali word for this is metta, a word so simple, yet so expansive it can hold the entire world within it. Metta means loving kindness, an unconditional goodwill toward all beings. It asks for nothing in return. It doesn't demand. It doesn't cling. It simply wishes for the happiness and well-being of others, whether they know it or not, whether they return it or not. And here's the profound truth. Real love is not about possession. It's about presence. When you're with someone you love, truly love, you don't trap them in expectations. You don't measure their worth by how much they need you or how often they stay. You simply wish for them to be well, to be free from suffering, to be at peace. But most of us have only known the other kind, the love tangled in attachment. Attachment is different. It masquerades as love, dresses itself in beautiful words, sweet moments, and promises of forever. But beneath the surface, it's not about the other person's happiness. It's about what they give to you. When we're attached, we need them to behave a certain way, to love us back, to stay, to fill the empty places we're too afraid to face alone. And when they don't, we suffer, terribly. Buddhism teaches that this craving, this attachment, is the very root of suffering, because everything in life, including the people we love, is impermanent. They will change, they will leave, or one day they will die. And if our happiness is chained to them when they go, they take us down with them. This doesn't mean you shouldn't love. It doesn't mean you should build walls around your heart and walk through life untouched. It means you're invited to love differently, to love in a way that frees both you and the other, to practice metta, the kind of love that says, may you be well, may you be happy, may you be free from suffering. Whether that happens in my arms or far away from me, I wish it for you just the same. Can you imagine how weightless that kind of love feels? A love that isn't a contract. A love that doesn't say, I'll love you if, but simply, I love you because I love you. It might sound impossible in a world so addicted to possession, but the truth is, the more you practice this kind of love, the lighter your heart becomes. You stop trying to control people. You stop needing them to stay. You begin to love not for what they bring to your life, but for who they are in their essence. And perhaps, for the first time, you start to experience what real freedom feels like. This is why Buddhist monks and nuns aren't forbidden from loving. They're asked to expand it, to let love grow so large it no longer clings to one person alone, but embraces all beings, to move from attachment to compassion, from craving to kindness. And you don't need to shave your head or renounce the world to do this. You can start right here, right now. The next time you feel that familiar ache when someone pulls away, when affection fades, when your heart begins its old dance of clinging, pause. Ask yourself, is this love or is this attachment? And if you find it's the latter, don't punish yourself. Smile at it. Recognize it as the old habit it is. Then gently, like a mother guiding a child, lead your heart back to metta. Wish them well, not because you're noble, but because it will set you free. And as you do, you might notice something remarkable. The people you love become brighter. the moments you share with them more tender. Because you're no longer holding them prisoner in your expectations. You're letting them be who they are, and loving them anyway. And isn't that what we've been seeking all along? Not a love that binds us, but a love that liberates us. This is the nature of true love as seen through the eyes of Buddhism. And it opens a door to an even deeper question. If love is not about possession, then why do we keep trying to own it? What is it inside us that makes us cling even knowing it hurts? To answer that, we need to journey inward, to trace the roots of our craving and confront the quiet fears we carry within. Let's go there. If there's one thing the Buddha understood about the human heart, it's this. We are all longing to be loved. Not in the shallow, passing way of the world, but in a love so vast, so steady, it can hold the weight of our fears, our hopes, and our fragile humanity. But where do you find a love like that? The kind that neither clings nor vanishes, the kind that uplifts without possessing, the kind that heals rather than hurts. The Buddha didn't leave us guessing. He gave us a map, a framework for a love that's boundless, fearless, and utterly liberating. It's known as the 4 immeasurables, 4 limitless qualities of the heart, like 4 lamps in the darkness, illuminating the path to a love that isn't confined by conditions or attachments. They're not just emotions, they're practices, skills you can cultivate, and each one unlocks a different dimension of what it means to truly love. Let's open them one by one. The first is Metta, loving kindness. You've met this one before. It's the heartfelt wish. May all beings be happy, but not a flimsy, polite kind of happiness. Not a shallow, Instagram-filtered version. It's the deep, soul-anchored kind of well-being, one that doesn't depend on circumstances or other people's approval. When you practice Metta, you're teaching your heart to love simply because it feels good to love. No contracts, no demands, just a sincere hope for happiness, whether that person is your lover, your enemy, or a stranger you'll never meet. And then comes Karuna, compassion. If Metta is the wish for happiness, Karuna is the tenderness that rises when you see someone suffering. It's that ache in your chest when you notice a friend quietly breaking. It's the impulse to reach out when someone's carrying more pain than they can hold alone. But compassion in Buddhism isn't pity. It isn't sorrow dressed as superiority. It's the deep understanding that pain is a universal experience, and the natural response of an awakened heart is to want to ease it. Then, mudita, sympathetic joy, may be the rarest and most beautiful of them all. This is the ability to feel genuine happiness for others' happiness, to celebrate their successes as if they were your own. In a world trained to compare, to compete, to quietly resent, mudita is revolutionary. It asks you to let go of the scarcity myth, to believe that someone else's joy takes nothing from you, that we can all rise together. And finally, upekkha, equanimity, the steady, unshaken heart, the ability to love without clinging, to care without collapsing, to remain balanced in gain and loss, praise and blame, joy and sorrow. Upekkha isn't coldness, it's clarity, the clear, calm seeing that knows life is a river constantly moving, always changing, and that to grasp at any moment is to suffer. It's the wisdom to love without possession, to show up fully in every relationship, but not make your happiness depend on it. Put together, these 4 immeasurables create a kind of love most of us have never tasted. A love that frees rather than binds. A love that doesn't collapse under disappointment. A love that doesn't shatter when someone leaves. It's the love of the awakened heart. And here's the thing, you don't have to be a monk, a mystic, or a saint to practice it. You can start with the people around you. The ones who make you laugh, the ones who test your patience, the ones you lost, and the ones you're still afraid to lose. Every thought of loving kindness you send their way, every act of compassion, every moment you let yourself feel joy for their joy. And every time you steady your heart in chaos, you're building the architecture of immeasurable love inside you. And little by little, you might notice, the way you love begins to change. It becomes softer, wider, braver. You stop needing people to be a certain way. You stop measuring your worth by how tightly they hold you. You begin to realize the love you were seeking wasn't outside you. It was you. It always was. And once you touch this kind of love, the four immeasurables, you'll never be satisfied with the cheap imitations the world offers. You'll crave depth, sincerity, a love that sees, a love that frees. But this path also invites a difficult question. If we can love like this, why do we so often settle for less? Why do we keep falling into the same patterns of possessiveness, jealousy, and craving, even though we know it hurts us? What ancient ache inside us keeps pulling us back to that small, fearful kind of love? To answer that, we need to look deeper into the nature of human desire and the illusions we build around what we think love is supposed to be. Let's unravel that next. There's a quiet truth humming beneath every heartbeat, every whispered promise, every hand we hold. Nothing lasts forever. It's a truth we instinctively know, yet spend most of our lives running from, especially when it comes to love. We meet someone. The world sharpens in color. Every word, every glance feels electric, as if the universe in all its vastness finally made sense. And in those first tender days, it's easy to believe we've found something unbreakable, a forever. But Buddhism, with its unflinching gaze, reminds us all things are impermanent, including love. Not because love isn't beautiful, not because we're doomed to be lonely, but because everything in this world, every feeling, every moment, every person rises, changes, and eventually fades. This is the law of anicca, impermanence. The seasons turn, the faces we love age, the stories we tell ourselves evolve, and the passions that once set our hearts on fire cool, shift, sometimes even vanish. We don't like this truth. In fact, most of our suffering in love comes from resisting it. We cling to how things were in the beginning. We chase the high of the first touch, the first kiss, the first nights when nothing else in the world mattered. And when love changes, as it inevitably does, we panic. We blame. We grasp tighter or push away, desperate to make it feel like it once did. But the Buddha taught that clinging is the root of suffering, not change itself. It's not the fading of passion that breaks us. It's our refusal to accept its natural ebb and flow. Because here's the paradox. Love's impermanence is not its flaw. It's its beauty. Imagine if every sunset were the same, if the taste of your favorite meal never varied, if every embrace felt identical. It's precisely because moments are fleeting that they feel sacred. That one night you stayed up talking until dawn. That random afternoon drive where you both laughed over nothing. The silence you shared while watching the rain. These moments shimmer because they cannot last. And in their passing, they leave behind something softer, quieter, a kind of wisdom. Buddhism invites us to love fully, knowing it will change. To hold people, not with clenched fists, but with open palms. To let each version of them, the one you met, the one you cherished, and the one you may someday lose, exist in your heart without war. Because when we stop demanding permanence from what is by nature impermanent, love becomes lighter. Less a desperate grasp, more a graceful dance. You begin to appreciate people for who they are now, not who they used to be. You find beauty in the evolving seasons of your relationships. You realize that endings aren't failures, they're simply transformations. Some loves last a lifetime, some a season, some a single breathless moment, and all are precious. This teaching isn't meant to make us cynical. It's not saying love is pointless or that nothing matters because it won't last. Quite the opposite. It's a call to wake up, to be present, to cherish, to let go. When you know this touch might be the last, you feel it more deeply. When you realize this conversation may never happen again, you truly listen. When you understand every goodbye carries the weight of impermanence, you learn to part with tenderness. And strangely, when you stop clinging to love, you experience it more purely, not as possession, not as a guarantee, but as a living, breathing miracle you get to witness, however long it stays. This acceptance of impermanence doesn't mean we stop loving. It means we start loving better. We forgive faster. We linger longer. We say "I love you" without waiting for the perfect moment, because the perfect moment is now. It always was. And when the time comes to let go, whether of a lover, a version of yourself, or a season of your life, you do it with grace, not because you don't care, but because you finally understand that holding on too tightly is what hurts the most. So if love is impermanent, what can we trust? Is there any kind of love untouched by time, by loss, by death? The Buddha believed there is. A love not rooted in craving but in liberation. A connection not shackled by fear but expanded by wisdom. To find it, we must learn to love not from hunger but from wholeness. Not from needing to be completed, but from the overflow of a heart at peace. And that, my friend, is where we go next. It's easy to believe that love is about the other person. Their smile, their kindness, the way they make you feel seen in a world that often looks right through you. But what if I told you that every relationship you've ever had is not about them at all? That the greatest role your lover plays is the mirror they hold up to you. Because here's a truth many of us resist. Romantic relationships aren't just where we find comfort. They're where we come face to face with ourselves. The Buddha taught that the world outside is a reflection of the world within. When someone angers you, it reveals where you're still holding onto pride. When someone neglects you, it exposes your longing for validation. When someone loves you, it can unearth the places you still believe you are unworthy. In this way, lovers become our greatest teachers, not because they're perfect, not because they never fail us, but because through them, we encounter parts of ourselves we might otherwise avoid. Think about it. Why does one small comment from a partner sting so much more than a stranger's insult? Why do their absences feel like abandonment, their silences like rejection? It's because our hearts are invested, our egos are exposed. In love, we drop the masks we wear in public. We soften, we risk. And in that vulnerable state, everything unresolved within us rises to the surface. Old wounds, childhood fears, buried insecurities. We see them not as abstract concepts, but as living, breathing experiences triggered by the people we care for most. That's why Buddhism doesn't view romantic love as a mere distraction from spiritual life. Quite the opposite. It's one of the richest fields for inner practice. Because no meditation cushion, no sacred text, no silent retreat will test your patience, compassion, or equanimity like an intimate relationship. It's easy to be kind to a stranger. It's another thing entirely to be kind to your partner when they forget something important to you. To stay mindful when jealousy grips your chest. To respond with tenderness when your ego screams for revenge. In these moments, love becomes practice. Each conflict an opportunity to choose awareness over reaction. Each disappointment a lesson in non-attachment. Each act of forgiveness a quiet rebellion against the mind's craving for punishment. This doesn't mean we endure harm or excuse cruelty. Buddhist wisdom isn't about self-sacrifice. It's about seeing clearly. When a relationship becomes abusive or toxic, it's a reflection too of where we might be clinging to pain, mistaking it for love. But when a relationship is honest, mutual, and kind, even in its imperfections, it becomes a sacred space, a training ground, a place where we learn to speak truthfully without blame, to listen without defensiveness, to love without ownership. Slowly, we begin to realize that the anger we project onto our partner often belongs to old stories we've carried for years, that the fear of abandonment isn't about them leaving, but about our own disconnection from self. And with each realization, love becomes less a battlefield and more a sanctuary. We learn to see our partner not as the source of our happiness, nor the cause of our suffering, but as a fellow traveler. Another being navigating their own fears, longings, and impermanence. And when we relate to them from this place of understanding, something remarkable happens. Arguments soften, resentments dissolve. Love deepens, not because it's always blissful, but because it becomes real, rooted in the messy, beautiful truth of two flawed, evolving humans choosing to wake up together. In this way, every romantic relationship, whether it lasts a lifetime or a fleeting season, becomes a teacher. Each one leaves behind a lesson, a scar, a gift. And if we're wise, we collect these lessons not as wounds, but as sacred offerings. Proof of where we've stretched, where we've stumbled, where we've chosen love over ego, presence over projection. Because ultimately, the lover across from you is a reflection of the lover within you. And the deeper you know yourself, the deeper you can love another. It's not a journey of finding the perfect person. It's a practice of becoming the person who can love perfectly in all the imperfect ways humans do. And perhaps, in learning to see relationships this way, we begin to glimpse the kind of love the Buddha spoke of, a love unclouded by craving, untethered from possession, rooted in freedom, the kind of love we'll explore next. There's a question that quietly lingers in the hearts of many spiritual seekers. If love is so beautiful, if connection is so deeply human, then why did the Buddha and so many of his disciples renounce it? Why choose a life without romance, without family, without the tender warmth of a lover's embrace? Is it denial, escape, or something far more profound? To understand this, we need to look beyond the surface of what love appears to be, and into the invisible chains it can so easily forge. For most of us, love begins as freedom. It sweeps us off our feet. It makes us feel alive, cherished, significant. But slowly, and often without noticing, love starts to bind. We begin to cling, to expect, to attach our happiness to another's presence, moods, and choices. A glance turns into a need for reassurance. A tender word becomes a demand for loyalty. A shared life quietly transforms into a shared cage. The Buddha saw this not because he was against love, but because he understood craving. In craving, we suffer. And romantic love, as beautiful as it can be, often carries the seed of craving. The monastic path, then, wasn't created to reject love, but to discover a different kind of freedom. A freedom where one's peace isn't contingent on another's affection, where joy arises not from possession, but from presence, where love is no longer confined to one person, but radiates equally toward all beings. The monks and nuns who left behind worldly love weren't escaping intimacy. They were seeking intimacy with the present moment itself. They weren't avoiding relationship. They were dissolving the very boundaries of self and other. But this doesn't mean the layperson's love is lesser, nor that romance has no place on the path to awakening. Buddhism, in its wisdom, offers both ways. For the householder, love becomes practice within the messiness of daily life. It tests patience, demands forgiveness, calls for mindfulness in moments of jealousy, tenderness in the face of betrayal. Romantic relationships can be vehicles for profound spiritual growth if approached with awareness. For the monastic, love transforms into boundless compassion, no longer directed at one, but extended to all. A monk's heart aches for the suffering of strangers. A nun weeps for the sorrow of a world she no longer clings to. Both paths teach love. Both paths demand courage. And both paths, in their own way, confront impermanence. Because whether you vow your heart to one person, or release it to the whole world, loss is inevitable. The partner you adore will age, sicken, leave, or die. The self you cling to will fade, shift, transform. Monastic freedom is not the absence of love. It's the absence of attachment. And in that absence, an astonishing thing happens. Love remains pure, luminous, and vast. It becomes Metta, Karuna, Mudita, Upekkha. Loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. A love that asks for nothing. A love that clings to no one. A love that frees both the giver and the receiver. But here's the part most people miss. You don't have to shave your head or leave your home to taste this love. You can be a lover, a spouse, a parent, and still practice letting go. You can fall in love 1,000 times and each time remember, this too will pass. And in that remembrance, you cherish without clinging. You embrace without possessing. You hurt without being broken. The Buddha's monastic freedom isn't a rule book, it's an invitation to see whether your love binds or liberates. whether it entangles you in craving or opens you to deeper wisdom. Because ultimately, whether lay or monastic, every heart seeks the same thing, a love that doesn't shatter when life changes, a peace that survives desire, a joy untouched by gain or loss. And while the robes of a monk or the embrace of a lover may look different, both can lead to awakening if walked with open eyes. The question is not which path you choose, but whether you walk it consciously. And as we reach the final part of this journey, one truth remains. No matter how we love or who we love, impermanence follows, and in its shadow we discover what endures. Let's return to that truth one last time. And so here we are. After wandering through the landscape of longing, attachment, compassion, and impermanence, we arrive at a simple, quiet truth. Love was never meant to be a cage, not for you, not for the ones you cherish. It was never meant to be a bargain. I'll love you if you stay, or I'll be happy only if you love me back. Because as we've seen, the very nature of life is change. The people we adore today will someday leave, transform, or fade. And if our peace is tied to them, our hearts will forever be at the mercy of the world's shifting winds. But there's another way, a way the Buddha pointed to with such gentleness so many centuries ago, to love without clinging, to care without controlling, to give without demanding, and to let every relationship, romantic, platonic, familial, become a mirror for our own awakening. When we stop trying to possess love, we discover something miraculous. Love was never outside of us to begin with. It isn't owned, traded, or lost. It's a boundless field within, waiting to be uncovered when craving subsides. And from this place, you can truly love others, not because you need them to complete you, but because you already feel whole. This is the peace the monastics sought, and it's the same peace a lover, a parent, a friend can touch in the middle of daily life. You don't have to abandon romance to find freedom. You just have to stop binding your heart to impermanent things. Let love be free. Let yourself be free. Let those you hold dear walk beside you, not because you fear losing them, but because you honor their freedom as much as your own. And in doing so, you'll touch a kind of peace no storm can shake, a joy untouched by gain or loss, a love that neither clings nor abandons, a heart that holds all beings, including yourself, with kindness, compassion, and graceful release. This is the essence of the path. This is the true art of loving. If this message touched something in you, if you found clarity, warmth, or even just a quiet moment of reflection here, I'd love for you to stay connected. Subscribe to our channel for more stories, wisdom, and reflections from the timeless teachings of the Buddha. Like this video if it resonated with your heart, and share it with someone you care about, because sometimes the most compassionate thing we can give is a little light on someone's path. Until next time, may your love be free, may your heart be steady, and may your path lead you home.